where do we start? So before we get into starting up, what are some things that yourselves maybe look to do prior to even stepping on the court for the first time? So maybe what are the things that we're looking at before we get the athletes even in our gym or in a training environment?
The first thing is just understanding where the athletes are coming from. So understanding what they've been doing before they've stepped in the gym or on the court, so that you understand what their foundation is, how much work that's been done, so that you can get some kind of idea of how much load they can tolerate in those first few weeks as you start to ramp up training.
I'm going through my third group startup, and there's definitely been a common theme is that the ability for the athlete to have access to adequate training equipment and space is so varied that you're going to be, no matter what, dealing with a non-uniform group. So they're going to be coming in all different kinds of levels of physical fitness. And I think you need to really adhere to that and really take kind of stock of that. I've had some other questions from coaches around fitness testing. So should they do fitness testing? Should they do strength testing? And my advice has been no, because you're going to give advantage to those who've had access to barbells if you're going to be doing things like squatting and deadlifting as a maximal strength testing, and disadvantaging those who didn't have access to that.
Had a bit more time in the lead up to return. So let's say you know that you're 8 to 6 weeks out from returning. What are maybe some things that you would focus on or try to address? And maybe, if equipment isn't a major limitation, what were some things or what some key pieces that you would want to try and focus on with the athletes before getting into training again?
Those first 6 weeks is going to be critical to building and reestablishing some kind of physical tolerance and some kind of physical base of both strength and overall capacity. Just as Mike said, you're having guys come in with multiple different levels of readiness. Some have trained completely and are at a really good level and a really strong level of support, but others may not have had that same access to resources. So you're actually trying to build up levels of strength, build up levels of fitness, just general capacity, so that when they come onto the court and they start even low-level jumping, they have some level of both muscular strength and tolerance, but also the tendons in your lower body and upper body have been exposed to some kind of stress, so that the first time they go in and do serving at practice or swinging at practice or jumping at practice, that's not the first time that those regions have been stressed. So taking some time just to really build out, general capacity, lower body strength, upper body strength, taking care of your rotator cuff, and just trying to link everything together so that when you start your specific ball training, they've already been exposed to a certain amount of load by that point.
So now we have the athletes back in the training environment. What are some things that you maybe want to consider in the early phases of that on court or on sand training environment for your athletes?
I think it's understanding where you need to get to as well. So if you start with the end in mind and working your way back from that time point. Right now we have the luxury of a significant buildup of time to get to that final product, whether it's game-specific jumping, duration of high-intensity work, swings. So understanding kind of your end point and then working yourself back from that point. So in those first 2 to 3 weeks in the sand or on court for us are largely lower intensity and just getting a little bit of familiarity back with even just simple skills, pass, set, hitting from the ground, light serving, just getting a little bit of that specific work and that foundation of specific work back under them, and then progressively ramping up from that point. But being a little bit more patient with our buildup is really important from coming back from a little bit more of a downtime than we've been used to.
And to add to that, I would say the conversations I've had with volleyball coaches recently is to not fall into the trap of having a training camp, especially if you don't have a competitive season coming up, because coaches are the creatures of habit, and they're going to do what they've always done because that's what they know. And they really want to get going, and the athletes too. Culturally, that's what they would like to do. They're super excited to get out there, and you as the coach, the strength coach, or the volleyball coach, you're the one that's holding the reins, and you need to hold them back. As Ryan's saying, let's hold them back. We've got a lot of time to develop a lot of physical attributes and a lot of skill. So let's take that time, because hopefully we never have this situation again. But this is a great time to develop some of those things you may not get to develop.
And the big thing is that injuries generally happen from doing too much too soon. So how do you gradually build up that tolerance so that it's progressive in that overload, rather than getting them into, athletes are passionate, coaches are passionate about seeing everyone playing at high intensity and being in a game situation. That's why everyone loves to play the sport. But let's get them there in a way that allows them to play consistently and time again, so that they're not in a position where you have one great high intensity practice or one great week and then everyone's back on the therapy table for 2 to 3 weeks because they just haven't spent the time building up that tolerance.
So then to continue that progression, so if we get through those initial phases and we're starting off slow and we're slowly progressing, what are some tools or tricks or approaches that you would then look to understand how to continue that progression? Obviously, we talk a little bit about the goal in mind, but and where we're trying to get to at the end. But this could be, as we're saying, it could be a really long ramp up to our main competitive season, longer than we're used to. So what are some thoughts about how to continue through this for the coming months?
The big thing that we're attacking this with is progressing in 2 to 3 week chunks. So understanding what we're going to do for the next 2 to 3 week block, monitoring our athletes through that block. So how are they responding both physically? So are we seeing any increases in tendon pain or muscular pain? Are we seeing any injuries crop up overall? But also mentally. Are they enjoying training? Are they distressed in any sense? Are they still enthusiastic about progressing training? Those are the two big things that we watch, and specifically when we're paying attention to tendon health, so things like jumper's knee or things in your shoulder. What we expect it sometimes to be sore after training, but we don't expect it to continue to get sore over the next 24 to 48 hours. So you want to see it, if it peaks in training, you want to see it slowly go back to resting over the next 24 hours. But if it hasn't, that's where we start to just flag it and have a little bit more attention to how we're progressing. And we wait until we're seeing these normal resolutions in muscle soreness and tendon soreness before we start to think about progressing.
One of the things Ryan mentioned there around, there will be periods in the training plan where it's going to be high volume and relatively high intensity. And when that time comes, I think just having kind of the rule of thumb in the back of the head of, okay, well, if that's going to happen, the following training block, there should be some built-in recovery or low loads as a non-negotiable. Because if we try to push them for too long, you will start to see some of these problems, and then eventually you won't be able to run practices or run the strength and conditioning program the way you want it. And, in terms of, tracking their progress, I mean, I'm a pretty simple person, and, if I had absolutely nothing and access to no technology or little technology, I mean, we can look at things like daily wellness questionnaires. They're quite easy to administer. We can look at collecting, in the weight room, load volume relationships. We can look at jump volumes on court. We can look at how many big swings our outsides are going to be doing. So looking for those elements of where is the high intensity efforts and how am I going to track those, all the way to using some actual softwares that are available. And there's an absolute multitude of them available out there. But I would say, if you're not tracking something, you're kind of guessing as to how the athlete's responding to what you're giving them as a practice or training stimulus. And if we're going, as tradition goes, if we're only doing it every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks as a fitness test, you're really, you're missing a lot of really valid information in between those time points that could actually be telling and painting you a way better picture of how your athletes are responding and interacting with the training stress. So I would actually, still have those time points of where you are going to do some of that more traditional fitness physical testing, but we need to be doing things weekly at a minimum, if not, daily for some of those things.
And Mike, something I really like that you guys are doing with the indoor team is just even going around and how do your knees feel today and how do your shoulders feel? It's like a very simple, low level, we don't need a ton of technology for that. All you need is a pen and a paper. And it gives you just a good way to check in on both individuals and also the team as a whole to see how each person is responding to training, but also how's the overall program and the overall team responding. I think that's a great approach you guys have.
Common one that's a low tech solution for the training load is the rating of perceived exertion. So an RPE scale, and there's a lot of good resources out there that I think coaches can look into. But again, using a pen and paper based solution, or even you can set them up in simple Google Docs and Google Sheets and have athletes complete it on their phone as well to help track how much is the training volume and what's that athlete's perception of how hard it is. So I think that's great feedback. One thing I wanted to maybe dive into a little bit deeper, because I know this is a challenge for a lot of coaches, is in that progression. I mean, coaches often think we can either progress volume or intensity or both. So any thoughts on how we go about or advice for coaches as we're progressing through the season around kind of that idea of like that volume intensity relationship?
If you're going to progress one, you don't progress them both at the same time. So it's either you allow the intensity to kick up a little bit for that 2 to 3 week block, or even 10 days, and then you allow the other one to go up. And generally we operate in 15-minute increments, so we go from 60 to 75 to 90 to 105 to 120 minutes, and through that we're also ticking up intensities. So if a given practice duration or training duration will be 90 minutes for 4 weeks, the first half is keeping that intensity the same. Then the next half of that block is increasing the intensity a little bit now that they've got that volume underneath them. But you definitely don't want to try and increase both at the same time, because then that's exponentially increasing the load that athletes are under.
And there's some good work out of Anthony Turner's group in the UK, where he put out a decent paper talking about novice, intermediate, advanced trainees. And what's interesting is I see a lot of advanced methods from a programming planning standpoint being given to novice athletes. We keep it simple, and we're looking at the old linear models. The original models work really well for novices who've never done a whole lot. As they get a little bit more trained, then we're looking at more block models or conjugate or undulating models, because they're going to require that. And in a volleyball setting, I would say what's interesting at the national level is you see that progression in the 18 guys. Our coach definitely runs a nonlinear conjugate model of planning, even within his volleyball setting. So, and that marries well with the strength training of the guys at that level anyway. But for the younger athletes at the club level, and even potentially the first 2 years of a university level, they respond very well to a traditional linear model. Especially if there's no competition.
Mike, do you mind going into what you mean by that, like a linear model versus a block versus a conjugate?
Yeah, so like a linear model is it looks like a wave. And so, volume and intensity, as Ryan was mentioning, volume and intensity are an inverse relationship. And in the traditional models, the volume would be, you would build that up first and then progressively build up intensity over a long period of time. But what you do is you wave back down. So you're always building up and you're waving back down in terms of intensity or volume, whichever one of those that you're developing. A conjugate or a nonlinear model is trying to look at the key physical characteristics. So whether that be, I'll keep it simple, strength, power, endurance, and looking at training all three of those within a given week or 10-day period. So you're touching on all the important physical characteristics. Some periods of time, two of them might be more important over the other one. But generally speaking, you're trying to develop multiple characteristics at the same time. What I've seen from younger athletes is they respond really well off the linear model initially. because they tend to need to do lots of repetition to get technically really good at the movements they're doing. So slowly progressing the intensity of their movements is a good way, because they take time to develop those qualities. And when I say develop them, I mean a long-lasting change in what they're doing, so that it's an actual cemented training adaptation within their physical structure.
Sort of on the volleyball side, it's thinking about having, some days will be very high intensity and very, very taxing physically, but then some days will be a little bit lighter and a little bit technical. So it is sort of still touching on all those different capacities within your training plan, especially as you get a little bit closer to the start of your season, trying to touch each of those different capacities at the same time, and gradually sort of shifting what is important based on where your team is progressing and its overall objectives.
Any kind of final either guiding principles or takeaways or some key pieces that are in your minds as you're getting back into this back into training now that you'd want to maybe leave our listeners with here?
I think in those first initial phases, it's starting out general and really building to specific. So if we just talk about percentages, if you're 100% general, which is off court strength and conditioning work, it gradually, as you progress towards your specific parts of the season where you want to be at your best and peaking, it becomes incrementally less work on the general and more work on the specific on court work, but also still trying to incorporate some elements of general work into, whether it's into your warm up, whether it's into your recovery and your cool down or your off days, so that you're maintaining that resilience and robustness and tolerance over the course of your season. So working with your strength and conditioning coach, working with your support team to find those opportunities to maintain capacity, because if your season is 4 months long or 6 months long, or in a beach volleyball context, our season could be almost 10 months long. How are you maintaining some of those capacities that are going to pay off when it's important? So strength doesn't just peak before the season and go down across the entire season, or tolerance doesn't peak and then go down. It's really maintaining those capacities as best as you can through the entire year.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is to keep an eye on the kind of stress fatigue levels outside of the volleyball court and the weight room. Because at the university level, one of the things we pay attention to is around deadlines for papers and exams. And just to be aware of that, especially as you get halfway through this training season, because motivation will start to dissipate potentially. And so it's keeping an eye on all those other things outside of the sport in the weight room that will definitely impact how they respond to the training stress we're giving them in the weight room or on the volleyball court. So it's just having this kind of holistic, kind of well-rounded vision or, lens on your athletes as they progress through these months. So once they're up and running, great. And you've gotten them through the first 6 to 12 weeks, that's awesome. There wasn't any major injuries. Keep it going. Don't rest on your laurels, and just keep it going in terms of the tracking of data and the monitoring, and just staying in touch with those athletes off court.
And it's really understanding too that each athlete may respond completely different to the plan, both what everyone's doing as part of the team, but also their stressors outside of life. Michael and myself may be exposed to the same coursework, the same classes, the same training session, but we both may experience and perceive that stress very differently. So understanding that some athletes may need an off day or may need a lighter day when other athletes are jazzed to be at practice, and that's the part that fires them up and helps them relieve some stress. So just working within those differences is always a very challenging piece in a team atmosphere, but that's what pays off sometimes some huge dividends, because some athletes get pushed and some athletes get a recovery when they both need it.
We talked about the RPE,
Mm-hmm.
but what would be like, what are you guys looking at the highest level? Like what's the dream environment? Budgets no no object here. What are the pros doing? What are the best in the world doing for trying to monitor the athletes, maybe monitor the load and maybe even the response to the load?
So we bucket load into 3 different areas. Physiological, so heart rate. If you think about, you sit on a bike and you ride the bike for an hour as hard as you can, that's going to have a really high physiological load, but it's not going to have the second piece, which is a mechanical load. So if you jump or you swing, you're causing mechanical stress to your legs or your shoulder or just your body. So we monitor mechanical load. And then the third one is wellness. So how are athletes doing mentally, emotionally? So those are our 3 big. We monitor physiological load through looking at heart rates through training. We look at mechanical load through monitoring jumps. We look at wellness by monitoring a self-report scale every morning in terms of how athletes are doing. So it's called the Hoover-McKinnon questionnaire, and it's just 7 questions that track overall stress and overall well-being on a daily basis. So we use those 3 lenses when we're looking at overall our monitoring system, paired with just understanding how the athletes are doing subjectively. So if I ask someone, hey, how are you doing today? Knowing based on that response, based on whether they say fine or good or great or okay, knowing those intonations and those changes, just even how they respond to those daily questions.
If I was to say a volleyball coach, what they would need, those vert units are pretty nice. Very simple, very, they're reliable, they're valid. They give us some really nice numbers. And one of the struggles I've always had coming up through the system in strength and conditioning is really understanding what the coach is doing on court or within the sporting practice, and how that interacts with what I'm doing. So I'm not, beating a dead horse, so to speak. So having those vert units is been really helpful, both at the national level and a university level.
I'll end it there, and I want to thank you both for all your time, and just want to wish the best of luck to all the teams as they get back into training.